Welcome to ANAB's webinar on the Global Accreditation Cooperation Incorporated, the future of the IAF, ILAC, and international recognition. My name is David Feist. I will be the facilitator for today's webinar. Our presenter will be Warren Merkel. Let's cover a few logistics right off the bat. Um, all attendees are muted because of the high number of attendees that we currently have. We do encourage that you submit any questions via the Q&A box. We have reserved time at the end of Warren's presentation to be able to address your questions. Now let's talk a little bit about our presenter. Warren Merkel is ANAB's Vice President of Policy. He is the treasurer for the IAF, the International Accreditation Forum, and a board member. He is also the vice chair of the IAAC, the Inter-American Accreditation Cooperation. This is perfect timing for this talk. Warren is just days back from the GAC organization meeting. So, Warren, I'm going to hand everything over to you now.
Great. Thank you very much, David. And thanks to so many of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this webinar. I definitely encourage you to take advantage of the Q&A. I'd like to spend as much time as necessary to answer questions because this topic has been in the works for a long time, and we're finally now getting to the point where there are some answers, and we know what questions are left to be answered between now and sometime next year. So we could advance the slide, David. I don't know if, there we go. So the topics that I'll cover today are the timeline and milestones in the transition from the current international organizations of IAF and ILAC to the Global Cooperation Incorporated. We're going to talk about plans for transitioning from the ILAC and IAF marks that are so well recognized in the marketplace to the new organization and how that organization is going to establish its own mark and its place in the regulations and industry acceptance that have been gained by ILAC and IAF. And then how and when these changes might affect all of you, whether you come from an accredited conformity assessment body, you're a scheme owner, or other types of stakeholders. There will be, to a certain degree, some changes that will happen in the background, but other things that will be coming that will certainly affect your work and how you engage with the global community in the accreditation space. So let's talk a little bit about the terminology here. The current global arrangements among accreditation bodies are established to promote recognition of conformity assessment results from accredited conformity assessment bodies. From the beginning of these international discussions, there were two organizations. The International Accreditation Forum, IAF, established a multilateral recognition arrangement, MLA, among accreditation bodies that focused on certification initially, management systems certification, certification of products, processes and services, and persons, and more recently, validation and verification bodies. Earlier, but on the same timeline, the International Laboratory Accreditation Conference and then cooperation were established to also promote mutual recognition among accreditation bodies of laboratories, calibration laboratories, testing laboratories, and eventually medical laboratories, inspection bodies, proficiency testing providers, and reference materials producers. Now we have a lot of other webinar content that get into the details of how this global system works. But underneath these two global organizations, to make this system function, there are other organizations in support. If we go to the next slide. Recognized regional cooperation bodies are where the peer evaluations of the accreditation bodies like ANAB occur. There are 6 of them that cover all of the various regions of the globe to have both regional cooperation to promote that recognition process and the evaluations, as well as in many cases to engage with regional political or economic organizations. As David mentioned, I'm the vice chair of the Inter-American Accreditation Cooperation that focuses on the Western Hemisphere, North, Central, and South America. But we also participate in the Asia Pacific Accreditation Cooperation, APAC, that covers the countries that participate in APEC as well as a number of other countries and economies. These organizations are part of those global systems and will continue to operate just as they have in support of that global recognition system. The change that's happening is really at that global level. But if we go to the next slide, we're going to find that this has been a long time in the making. And to a certain degree, there's been a lot of discussion for a long time that finally is culminating in some changes. I looked at the attendee list briefly, and I know there are some metrology people there. I apologize, my timeline is not to scale, but the earliest cooperation related to accreditation of conformity assessment bodies happened back in the 70s in the International Laboratory Accreditation Conference, recognizing at that early date that with the growth of global trade, the use of international standards for conformity assessment and supporting the trade of goods, that there was a need to benchmark how laboratories are accredited in various parts of the world. These were very early days, but it was the beginnings of recognizing the importance and the value of accreditation to supporting both public and private sector policy. We jump ahead to the 1990s when a couple things started to happen. First, across the globe, there was a recognition of the value of the use of international standards for quality management systems and related activities. ISO 9001 became a very well-used tool in the international marketplace, as well as domestically to support industries' objectives for quality. There were organizations that were accrediting the certification bodies or registrars, as they were called at that time in the United States. And so the International Accreditation Forum was established to bring together across the globe the accreditation bodies working in that space. 3 years later, that International Laboratory Accreditation Conference that had continued to work together established a similar international accreditation cooperation, functioning as an organization of accreditation bodies and stakeholders to look to harmonize initially laboratory accreditation and then extending into those other scopes that I mentioned earlier. On that timeline, if you think about the time from 1993, 96 to 2000, that's a relatively short period of time for those two organizations to fully establish, with the support of the regions, mutual recognition arrangement and multilateral recognition arrangement, respectively, for the two organizations. That happened in 2000 in Washington, D.C., and I was really fortunate at the time to be involved in accreditation and be local. So I was one of the few people that was present at that event in 2000 that was also present at the meetings a few weeks ago where this next step toward global recognition took place. If I counted properly, there were probably only 5 or 6 people that were in both places, and certainly my role in 2000 was much different, and I was quite fortunate to be there. A lot of time passed from that initial establishment of IAF and ILAC to the point where the two organizations' members voted to form a single international organization for accreditation. If you think about the changes in the global trade environment, the changes in some of the regions of the world, establishment of different political and economic groups, a lot happened in that period of time. The two organizations had considered forming a single organization prior to 2019, but it took that long to really make the commitment and see the value in creating that single organization. Over that time, the value of international accreditation, the use of international standards, and most importantly, the confidence and trust that's provided by accreditation of the competence, the impartiality, and consistency of conformity assessment bodies really determined that these organizations matter, that regulations, laws, contracts, commitments around the world incorporated accreditation as part of the solutions to meet public and private policy needs. If you look at that year, 2019, the timing was somewhat unfortunate in that the next year there were a number of years due to the pandemic that in-person meetings weren't possible. And in my personal opinion, I think that delayed getting us to the point of 2024 when the members of both IAF and ILAC approved the fundamental documents to move the process forward to create a single organization. A lot of people referring to this step have referred to it as a merger of IAF and ILAC, and colloquially that's an easier way to perhaps describe what's happening, but it truly is both in intent and practice different than that. This is going to be a new organization that takes the components of IAF and ILAC and over time will create a single coherent system and organization dealing with accreditation globally. That step that the members took last year allowed for the Global Accreditation Cooperation Incorporated to be registered as a legal entity in New Zealand. There were 4 initial members that represented the accreditation bodies for the current chairs and vice chairs of IAF and ILAC. Lori Gillespie from ANAB is vice chair of IAF, and so ANAB was one of those 4 organizations. And that was really just to allow the legal process to get started and then to work with all of the current members of IAF and ILAC to get to the next step. One of the interesting aspects of how that's worked is that the sequence of events, both legally and organizationally, has been a challenge. And it's really been the work of the members and the Secretariat to ensure that this process has continued. And from that point last year to the meetings that we just recently had and looking forward to next year, there's been a tremendous amount of progress made. And it wasn't a foregone conclusion. There have been a number of challenges that have been identified and most of them overcome to get us to this point. So what were the objectives for this organization? The Global Accreditation Cooperation Incorporated is intended to support government, regulators, industry, and end users to implement their conformity assessment policies. There is a track record of success of leveraging the mutual recognition arrangement of ILAC and the multilateral recognition arrangement of IAF directly in or as supporting government and private sector policy. However, there are 2 organizations, and outside of the accreditation and maybe the conformity assessment community, the distinction is not easily described and it's not easily adapted when different types of conformity assessment might be part of those policy solutions. Having a single organization, just like the current IAF and ILAC use, will facilitate global trade through one multilateral recognition arrangement among all accreditation bodies that perform accreditation of conformity assessment. So it will not be distinguished by the type. It will be all signatories for accreditation, regardless of the types of accreditation they may provide. Ideally, this will promote international accreditation and the growth of its use to meet market needs, both for public and private sectors, and promote the accredited conformity assessment activities that are performed and the results from those accredited entities. As I mentioned earlier, the real reason we do this is to promote trust in those results. Decision makers rely on the output of conformity assessment bodies, and accreditation is a tool that can be used to provide that additional level of trust that the conformity assessment bodies have been assessed and found to be competent, impartial, and consistently operating. Anyone who's worked in IAF and ILAC will recognize that at the highest levels, there's been harmonization of how accreditation works. But in the global recognition process and its effect on conformity assessment bodies and organizations that use conformity assessment and accreditation, there's some differences, significant differences between the way that ILAC has established its documentation, its practices, and its approach to supporting accreditation bodies and providing guidance and requirements compared to IAF that has a different approach and perhaps I think it's objective to say a number more mandatory documents and requirements that conformity assessment bodies and accreditation bodies use to ensure harmonized practices. Ideally, and in the eyes of stakeholders, that often is not understood and perhaps could be done more efficiently. And so again, that's one of the primary objectives of creating a single organization. Now, I want to take a step back. Why do I keep saying Global Accreditation Cooperation Incorporated? We are in a world of acronyms, of insider language and terminology that most people don't really understand. Because we're still in this transition and the organization itself is quite new, we actually don't have the acronym and a mark and logo for the new organization fully protected in the marketplaces and in the different countries where it will be used. So until that happens, we continue to use the full name of the organization as it was established legally. And I'll talk in a minute about how we will be rolling out the change to that, or not the change to the name, but certainly the new acronym and branding for this global organization. We can go to the next slide. So we've gone through the timeline up to the October meetings. The general assemblies of IAF and ILAC typically have taken place in the fall, and this marked the second General Assembly for the Global Accreditation Cooperation Incorporated. A short General Assembly was conducted in 2024 after the approval of those documents that I mentioned, the Constitution and general rules for the organization, just to serve the purpose of having a meeting of the members at that time to progress the legal process for establishing the organization. That first General Assembly was quite brief, but was attended by all of the IAF and ILAC members present, not just the 4 initial members. And it really was procedural to get us to the point where the second General Assembly could happen with significantly more members. Once there was certainty that we were moving forward with the Global Accreditation Cooperation Incorporated, all of the current IAF and ILAC members were invited to apply. In order to have them approved at that General Assembly that happened on the 23rd of October, there was a deadline for the initial round of applicants. And at that point, a significant majority of the current IAF and ILAC members had applied. 103 full members, those are recognized accreditation bodies, applied. 8 associate members, accreditation bodies working towards recognition, 38 stakeholder members, and all 6 of those regional cooperation bodies had applied by that point. All of those members were able to participate in the General Assembly and vote on a number of issues that came up, not the least of which is how the leadership of the organization will move forward. There are still a number of full members and the other membership categories, the associates and stakeholders, that have not yet joined. That does not represent all of the current members of IAF and ILAC. Just since that meeting in October, we have already over 15 more full members, I believe, and many other associates and stakeholder members that have applied. And so the hope is that we will be quite close to all of the current members of IAF and ILAC being able to either apply by the end of 2025 or be able to indicate that they are working with whatever recognition process may be necessary in their country to apply to the new organization as soon as possible in 2026. I'll talk a little bit about that future timeline in a moment. Any transition like this is going to have a lot of details. And so there were some key procedural and guidance documents that were approved at this General Assembly in order to change the ability of the organization to accept members from those initial 4, to look at documentation that is necessary for then transitioning the existing IAF and ILAC documents over to be Global Accreditation Cooperation Incorporated documents. The intent, and we're on track to do this, is to have the new organization function as a complete entity from the 1st of January 2026. So we're on track. There is part of the General Assembly was establishing a process for establishing the new MRA among the members that have transitioned and transfer the mark from ILAC and IAF to the Global Accreditation Cooperation Incorporated so that members of the new organization are able to continue to use those marks. We'll talk in detail about the transition of the marks in a moment. Another big step forward for the organization was electing its chair. Brahim Hula from the GCC Accreditation Center in Saudi Arabia was elected the chair. And the vice chair, Emanuele Riva from Accredia in Italy, was elected as the vice chair. Both of them will start their office as of the 1st of January of 2026. And so in the meantime, the existing interim leadership of the current chairs and vice chairs of ILAC and IAF will stay in place. This all was not, as I said earlier, a foregone conclusion. And it's quite interesting when we were establishing the program for this webinar, we planned these quite far in advance. And at that point, we were not entirely sure that this would be a webinar about progress that was been made or whether there might be a need to shift the timeline beyond the 1st of January 2026. So I'm quite proud of the progress that was made, the contributions that all of the member bodies made, and the listening, the collaboration, and the compromises that were necessary to bring these two organizations forward to this point and agree on a path that will get us to the overall goal of having a single organization for recognition of accreditation bodies at the global level. We go to the next slide. This was right after the election of the chair. I know it's a zoomed out picture, but there in the center is Brahim. Brahim is certainly for me a close personal colleague and friend, and is well known to the accreditation community and ANAB in particular, as he led our last peer evaluation in last year. All of the various members of the accreditation bodies and stakeholders were there and present for the picture. And other than the hours that we spent going through the procedural aspects of this was really the first time I think everyone recognized that we have this new organization and that the process is going to move forward. It was a huge event that ideally, if we do this right, only will be recognized as that kind of a milestone for the participants and for the accreditation bodies that are and stakeholder members that are supporting this. To those of you that are end users, we hope that there will be some visible changes in terms of the organization's name, the references to it, but that the accreditation process, the international operations of conformity assessment will move forward without a hitch. So let's talk a little bit about the organization itself and how it's set up. As with IAF and ILAC, the members make up the primary decision body for the organization. The General Assembly is made up of those members, and there's an executive committee chaired by the chair and vice chair of the organization, and also the chairs of the committees that are identified at the bottom of the organizational chart. There will also be a treasurer and quality manager appointed by the executive committee. I'm the interim treasurer for the organization just to get us to the point of January 1st, and then I will gladly pass the torch to the new treasurer, who will then take care of the finances for the organization in 2026 and beyond. If you look across the bottom, those of you that are in accreditation will recognize this from our work on establishing the structure of this organization. To those of you that are stakeholders or conformity assessment bodies, there are a few key things that I want to point out. The arrangement committee will be looking at the recognition process, how that works, and how that supports both the global and regional activities. The accreditation committee will be looking at harmonization practices across the organizations that participate, and that's both of those organizations will be critical as we bring together the current universe of documentation and practices that exist in IAF and ILAC. Under the technical committees, there are 3 boxes because there will be 3 technical committees. One technical committee 1 will deal with laboratory and the current types of accreditation covered by ILAC, laboratories, inspection, laboratories, PTP, proficiency testing providers, and reference materials producers. There will be a second technical committee that deals with certification, validation, and verification, and a third technical committee that deals with inspection. We recognize that it's really important to harmonize practices, but it's also critically important that we don't lose the focus on the very real differences that occur in the technical activities and the accreditation and conformity assessment processes in the laboratory and related areas, inspection, and certification and validation and verification. The stakeholder committee is pulling together the various types of stakeholder organizations that exist in IAF and ILAC into a single stakeholder committee. One of the very important characteristics of the global accreditation cooperation is that stakeholders have a vote. That was a practice in IAF, but not in ILAC. And it does happen in the Inter-American Accreditation Cooperation in some regions, but not all. That's a big change. And so those of you that represent stakeholders would have the opportunity to contribute to the votes on documents, but with a limit on the amount of influence from those stakeholders, given the need to ensure that there's a balance of interests and consideration of the fact that stakeholders are also, in some cases, subject to the requirements that come from the organization. And so there's a need to ensure that balance. There's an existing development support committee in both ILAC and IAF, so there's a single committee now to deal with developing countries and economies. And there's a communication committee that will be critically important going forward in getting the word out about the new organization. One last thing on the structure with those different committees. Between now and the end of the year, we'll talk about in a moment, those committee chairs make up the balance of the executive committee. And so we still have elections for those various committee chairs that will occur before the end of the year, so that come January 1st, we have the full executive committee in place. ANAB has put forward candidates for 2 of the technical committees, and we're hopeful and committed to providing the support necessary to get the new organization moving forward and ensure that those committees start out with as much success and impact as the current committees in both IAF and ILAC. Okay, now we can move forward. So what's next? As I mentioned, we will be electing those executive committee members. We have to come up with a mechanism for ensuring that any of the members that have applied after that October 21st deadline, but before the end of the year, and in an ongoing way, are able to be accepted into the new organization so that they can have a voice in the documentation and the other votes that will be happening, but also to ensure that we are getting full representation from as many accreditation bodies and stakeholders as possible. These next several months will have some critical work on transitioning documents. At the General Assembly in October and in the respective General Assemblies of IAF and ILAC, there were a number of the existing documents from those 2 organizations that were identified as needing to continue in their current form until work is done to establish similar documents in the new organization. That list has not been published yet to my knowledge, but will be published soon. For those of you that are accredited conformity assessment bodies and are used to implementing the policies and the mandatory requirements from IAF and ILAC, those documents and those requirements will continue. How those are labeled, whether they will be transitioned immediately to a Global Accreditation Cooperation Incorporated document, or they will be identified as being valid in the transition, is still something that needs to be finalized and announced. The key is that there will be no change in the way that the accreditation process works, the requirements that are implemented, and moving forward through the harmonization process, there will be a significant amount of consideration of how any parallel documents or similar but not entirely aligned documents will be transitioned into a single coherent set of documentation for the new organization. So that's just between now and December. January 1st is what might be, you could call it a soft launch, in that the Global Accreditation Cooperation will be fully operational. The MRA will be in place, documentation will be in place, and for the purposes of demonstrating mutual recognition among accreditation bodies, it will be among those signatories or members of the new organization. Early in January or soon thereafter, IAF and ILAC will discontinue what would be their normal operations as they exist now. The maintenance of the MLA for IAF, the MRA for ILAC, those activities will be transitioned to the new organization. Documentation, development, and evaluation will be part of the new organization. And at that point, in order to have a presence, there will be a temporary website established. Again, we're still in the process of getting the official acronym and other related information fully protected in as many countries as possible. And so until then, that January 1st date is a functional transition, but not the big launch. The intent is to have the publicized launch of the new organization occur in April of 2026. We will have the 3rd General Assembly meeting, as well as meetings of all of those various committees. And that will be the critical next step in ensuring that the terms of reference and the operations of those committees continue to do the good work and transition that work into the new organization without losing the momentum and the activity that is currently still going on right up until the end of the year in IAF and ILAC. The communications teams are working quite hard on a public event. If you are interested, the intent, I'll give you a heads up that will be coming out soon publicly. The intent is to live stream the beginning of those meetings in April. The good news is that it will be widely available, and ideally, I think that the plan is to have several important global stakeholders present to support the transition of the organization publicly, including the new acronym, the new mark, and its branding. So the bad news, if you're tuning into this webinar from the United States or in America, the General Assembly meetings are happening in Europe. And so it's going to be on the morning Central European time. And so it'll be quite early here in the US, but I'm sure just like this webinar, there will be a recording available and a great deal of publicity going on. We're really looking forward to being able to fully launch the organization at that point, be able to identify it by its new acronym, and really establish the presence of the organization as a resource that builds upon the important legacies established by IAF and ILAC and continues to support the policy needs in the public and private sector. We go to the next slide. So to loop back to the marks, this has been a really interesting aspect of the transition process, because once we have the new organization, then that functionality in IAF and ILAC has to go away. But the marketplace doesn't recognize the new organization yet. There are regulations, contracts, just a number of areas where both the reference to IAF and or ILAC, and importantly, there are marks when they are used on the results of conformity assessment, certifications, laboratory reports, inspection reports, all of the various outputs of conformity assessment bodies. People are used to looking for those marks. And so even though we will have the new mark established and publicized as of April next year, all of the members and stakeholders recognize that we cannot lose in that transition the reference to the IAF and ILAC mark. And so behind the scenes, there have been efforts to ensure that the ILAC mark is being transferred to the new organization, and the IAF mark will be maintained for a period of time and licensed exclusively to the Global Accreditation Cooperation in order to have that available to members and their accredited entities to use. Now, anyone who's around that knows there's a lot of agreements and other documents that go behind that. And so all of that transition will start in earnest after the April meetings next year. Recognizing the value of these marks in the marketplace and the need to ensure that the transition is sufficient for all of the stakeholders and users of accreditation to make the transition, those marks will be available for at least 3 years. And again, the new organization will have the opportunity to decide at what point the recognition of the new mark is sufficient in the marketplace to allow for that to be used in lieu of the ILAC and IAF marks. But in the meantime, I know that that's important to a number of our customers at ANAB, and the intent is to continue to have those marks available moving forward. As I mentioned, though, there are a number of existing organizations. If we go back to the previous slide, sorry about that, David. The former IAF and ILAC members that haven't yet joined the Global Accreditation Cooperation need to ensure that there's continuity of the use of the marks for their customers as well. And so we're in the process of determining what that will look like, what current members of IAF and or ILAC haven't joined yet, but will intend to join either before January 1st or soon thereafter. And the commitment is to ensure that those organizations will be able to continue to use the marks to minimize any potential disruption to their customers and to the marketplace. There are some accreditation bodies for different reasons that may be facing barriers to joining the new organization. And so we're hopeful that we're able to come to some type of solution for those organizations as well, that ultimately they're able to move forward, or we understand the implications on the use of the mark and the mutual recognition for those accreditation bodies moving forward. Okay, speaking of moving forward, let's go to my last slide. So what does this all mean? Well, the world's going to keep turning, and as much as this has been a significant change for us in the accreditation world and the conformity assessment world, we're hoping that it's really something that becomes a seamless process moving forward, and that as people recognize the new organization in terms of its name, its mark, its reference, and acceptance in the marketplace, then we'll all be able to continue to work as normal. The work of the accreditation community generally is going to move forward. As part of the General Assemblies of IAF, ILAC, and the Global Accreditation Cooperation, there was a recognition that there's some very important work, very important documents that are used in conformity assessment that need to be there moving forward. Documents, particularly those from IAF, the mandatory documents that may be referenced in schemes used by conformity assessment bodies and accreditation bodies, need to be available. And so any documents that need to be maintained for historical reference will be maintained and retained, I should say, to ensure that people have access to those documents in their final form as they existed in IAF or ILAC. But moving forward, there will be a new set of documents, new activities in the new organization to harmonize all of the criteria and all of the documentation between the two. The recognition processes that are ongoing at the regional level, as well as in the regions themselves, are being carried on. And the processes that are in process for evaluating currently all 6 regions actively will just transition into the new organization. And organizations that have recognition as accreditation bodies will be transitioned into the MRA of the new organization based on their most recent peer evaluations. As the transition for the marks evolves, there will be temporary arrangements in place until they're no longer needed or used. And again, that will be something that will directly involve those of you that use those marks in terms of a change perhaps in the licensing documents, but your accreditation bodies will certainly keep you informed of that and provide as much information as soon as they can to ensure that any disruption to the way that you use marks or your reference to your recognized accreditation will be as painless as possible. Under the new organization, all of the engagement activities where the accreditation community takes part in standards development, working with NGOs around the world, working with regulatory organizations, all of that and the representation will continue with oversight by the executive committee. We want to ensure that where the accreditation community's voice needs to be part of the conversation, that won't change January 1st. We just need to ensure that whatever process is necessary to maintain that representation is being handled, and that will be one of the first important activities of the executive committee. Also important for the executive committee will be the need to look at strategic plan for the new organization, and we started a good process for that in October to begin thinking about all of the various impacts that the new organization will have, and how do we ensure that the organization progresses and gets the recognition that IAF and ILAC members have worked so hard to evolve over the last 25 years. And while IAF and ILAC formally ceased normal operations as they exist now by 31st of December, the new organization will pick that up, ensuring that there is no gap in the recognition among accreditation bodies, but also that the wind down process for ILAC and IAF is also agreed by the members and should have no effect over the long haul on the ability of the new organization to maintain that representation and reputation for trust in the marketplace and promoting the value of accredited conformity assessment. All of this is a lot, and there's both some information here that I went into more detail than you may be able to get, but there's also a number of other issues that you may be interested in. And the link at the bottom of the screen is to a list of frequently asked questions for IAF on the current IAF website. I encourage you to go there if you have questions or want more information, and that will be updated as we learn more and as the transition process evolves. With that, I hope that there are plenty of questions, David, and I look forward to addressing your interests as soon as we talk about additional resources going forward.
Thank you, Warren. What a great presentation, and very informative and timely. We're going to get to the questions here in about a minute. There have been quite a few that have come in. In terms of ANAB, we have many additional resources, the webcasts, these webinars that are cached on our site and are accessible at any time. We have an ongoing blog. And in addition, we have training, which is available, self-paced, in-person, live online, private training. And we encourage you to avail yourself of those. But let's get to the questions right now. Warren, the first one is, who are some examples of stakeholders members and what qualifies them for membership?
Sure. There are a number of international organizations that represent conformity assessment bodies, represent various interests, technical interests, and so on, that can qualify for stakeholder membership. For the Global Accreditation Cooperation Incorporated, typically there's an interest in those organizations having a global scope, whether it be organizations like the TIC Council that represents conformity assessment bodies, or the IIOA, International for organizations that provide assurance. Those are just examples of those types of organizations that represent conformity assessment bodies. There are also scheme owners that can be stakeholder members to ensure that they are part of the conversation because they're a very important link in the process. And then other international technical organizations that have an interest in Global Accreditation Cooperation Incorporated. The information around membership and the categories is available in those FAQs, and also through links on the IAF and ILAC websites.
Okay, thank you, Warren. Another question that has come up, we saw the two individuals, Brahim and Emmanuel, who were the chair and the vice chair. Have there been any decisions on other members? We noted that you are interim treasurer.
Yes, well, I'm interim treasurer along with the current chair and vice chairs of ILAC and IAF as the interim leadership for the organization. There has been a deadline that's passed for expression of interest in those committee leadership positions. And so the chairs of the arrangement, accreditation, the three technical committees, the development support committee, the stakeholder committee, all of those positions have a slate of candidates, and the currently accepted members will be voting electronically for those chairs prior to January 1st, so that when we hit that date, there will be a functioning executive committee. After that, there will be ballots for the vice chairs for all of those positions and the appointment of the treasurer and quality manager by the executive committee. One of the key aspects of the Constitution and general rules for the organization is to make sure, to the extent that it's possible, that the leadership at that level is representing a diverse um, uh, a diversity among the regions of the world. And so the interest is really to ensure that moving forward, we have candidates that are not just from one part of the world, but represent all of the regions. And at this point, across those various positions that are open, I think there really is the opportunity to have all of the regions represented, as well as official representatives of those regions being part of the executive committee directly.
Perfect. I think that addresses a couple of the other questions that are here. There is a question. What you mentioned that there were some challenges in getting the global accreditation cooperation together, and you mentioned that it took since 2019, partially due to the pandemic. Can you address some of the challenges?
Sure. If you think of any organization that has, at that point, 19 plus years of history and well-established similar but different practices, coming up with a plan to actually transition that into a single organization, just from a logistics and details point of view, was difficult. There's also sort of my experience in the last couple of years is not to get to use an English phrase, the chicken and egg issue, where there's certain things that needed to be done, like incorporating the organization, but we couldn't really do that unless we had the membership's approval of the documents that were needed to get incorporated. But then you can't really recognize members or have members join until you've been legally incorporated. And so figuring out how to get to that point and how to take all the important components from the respective organizations and have a plan to pull them together into a single set of information, just it's taken a lot of time. More recently, once the organization was established, that triggered a lot of the accreditation bodies, particularly those that are affiliated with their governments, to go back and look at the implications of being a member of an arrangement among accreditation bodies, essentially. And there were some questions about the roles of stakeholders, the way that the accreditation bodies interact, and even the legal status of the organization itself to ensure that there wouldn't be any concerns from the governments of the accreditation bodies that there is, or an understanding at least of what the new organization would be and what the obligations to those organizations might entail, and to ensure that, as current IAF and ILAC clearly state, that if there's a conflict with national or other legal requirements, that those legal requirements would take precedence. There's a lot of details behind how we do this. Anybody who's gone through an assessment process or works in an accreditation body, we have so many details to consider. And so over the time, I think it's going to be an ongoing challenge to ensure that all of the different pieces have been transitioned appropriately and that we don't lose the value that that exists in all of that detail to support the trust that's out there in accreditation.
Okay, there's another question which just came in. If non-members are allowed to use the current IAF and ILAC marks, won't there be marketplace confusion for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, that's an excellent point that's being considered in that transition, particularly for those members that aren't able to join by January 1st. And I think one of the balancing acts that has to happen is what's the risk associated with allowing those organizations on a very temporary basis to have their accredited entities continue to use the marks that they've been entitled to use, while also ensuring that there isn't a short-term, perhaps unnecessary disruption to the marketplace by having to temporarily remove or not use those marks while the accreditation body is going through whatever necessary process they have to get the permission to then finally join. So yeah, that's an excellent question, and one of the challenges that the new executive committee, the new leadership, and members will have to consider moving forward. It's not an easy thing to deal with, but we certainly want to ensure that the accredited entities and the stakeholders that they serve don't get disadvantaged by the process that's been established to create the new organization. If there's any way to do that to maintain the confidence, we want to ensure that we take every possible precaution to do so.
Okay. You mentioned that there is a desire to have representation from all partners around the globe as part of the global accreditation cooperation. To that effect, let me read this. Is there any limit on how long someone can serve on the executive committee, or a limit on how many individuals from a region can be on the executive committee?
Yeah, there's a quite clear restriction that the chair and vice chair have to be from different regions. And we accomplished that because Brahim, his accreditation body, like ANAB, participates in 2 regions. And so once he was elected chair, that did affect the candidates that would be eligible for vice chair. Manuele comes from EA. And so both of them and the chairs of the various committees are elected for a 3-year term, and under the rules can be re-elected for another 3-year term. And so that does provide limits to how long people can be in place. And of course, it's not an automatic thing. They would have to put themselves up again for that second term if they were interested in. There's an interest in balancing the representation of the regions in those other technical committee chairs. And that was one of the issues that came up while we were in Bangkok at the meetings. And very recently, we've, I think, gotten a resolution from the legal counsel for the new organization to figure out how that's going to work. I think I'm optimistic that we've got a path forward on that. And moving forward, it's going to be new for all of us, because ILAC and IAF had their own respective leadership positions and governance structures. And now it's, to a certain degree, a smaller number of people that are engaged in that work. And so it becomes more important to ensure that, to the extent possible, that we have good, strong candidates, which I'm quite confident that we do, that are as representative of the range of regions and interests to the accreditation community as possible.
Okay. Thank you, Warren. That concludes the questions that we have. If you have any further questions regarding training or accreditation services, please reach out to ANAB. This presentation will be posted under our cached webinars, likely within the next 24 hours, and it will be accessible there. Again, thank you, Warren. This was a very informative presentation, and this concludes our webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.